conceptual writing is less other than postmodern, wholly foreign to or simply beyond it, than it is post-postmodern, which is to say intensifying certain strains within postmodernism in order to render it not so much a new postmodernism, but a kind of hyper-intense hyper-postmodernism. A power of the false derived not from the powers of the true, but one that remains the ground of any truth effects, right? One that creates something new rather than tries to falsify something old. The performance of poetry sparks other kinds of performance, provokes other powers of falsification, rather than primarily calling for contemplation or understandings of the truisms contained within the poetry. This sentiment is, of course, probably as old as the hills, or in poetic terms, it's at least as old as Jack Spicer's 1959 pronouncement, "No one listens to poetry." Quote, "No one listens to poetry," which is to say, no one listens to poetry, hearkens after or obeys its hidden truths. No, one listens to poetry, one responds to it. In the end, though, the positive pole of the powers of the false is hardly contained in any particular literary work or even a kind of work. It seems to me it doesn't need to be as relentlessly avant-garde as Andrews or Goldsmith's work is, but their work is instructive precisely in its relentlessness, because it's really foregrounding almost nothing but this sense of response and movement. Though one might be tempted at this point to begin putting together a list of operative texts that foreground this strong power of the false, creating something new, on the kind of eat this, not that template of contemporary weight management pseudoscience. So you might want to say Pynchon, not Foster Wallace. Brian Evanson, not William T. Volman. Hammett, not Chandler. Gertrude Stein, not Virginia Woolf. The Flaming Lips, not emo bands. Apatorai, not Baba. Nietzsche, not Hegel. Shakespeare, not Spencer. Irigaray, not Kristeva. Negri, not Agamben. Adorno, not Benjamin. Herzog, not Winders. Stephen Shaviro, not Bernard Stiegler. The Derrida of Force and Provocation, not the Derrida of Prayer and Tears. Or lastly, Jameson, not Jameson, depending on how you read him or what you emphasize within your reading. Of course, these last two quite deliberately suggest the utter nonsense of pretending to have located certain privileged texts that contain more power, more strong power of the false and less weak power of the false. Maybe at the end of the day, thinking about literature as equipment for post-postmodern living is less than a plea to read this, not that, than it is to read this way, not that way. Sure, literature and cultural theory have a powerful conceptual resource in meaning, memory, and nostalgia, and as such can be a wedge against the present in memory of a day gone by, a series of roads not taken. Likewise, on the sentence level of literature or on the theoretical plane of language, the linguistic turn can continue to mirror that kind of recovery project by slowing thought down, the weight of the signifier always forcing us to turn things over in our mind, to hesitate, to own the connections we make, and all that other kind of ethics of reading thematics. All that, I think, remains crucial to the arsenal of reading, of making sense rather than meaning of the present. But I guess I would want to insist that by itself, the linguistic turn of hesitating slowness does not constitute an effective arsenal against the present and its ubiquitous post-postmodernism of speed and production. So maybe now I'm back again to where the larger project that I'm working on began. Looking at critique as a mode of engagement with the present and trying to affirm or intensify some of its more positive modes. Again, trying to sort of invent this hermeneutics of situation, what can literature be good for, rather than a hermeneutics of suspicion, how can it undermine certain totalized claims. Which is not necessarily to exclude the negative or undermining models of dialectical critique, but to suggest they can't do all the work, or even most of it really. If something like Jamesonian dialectic is an operation primarily of overcoding, of rewriting one sense with another, you rewrite certain economic claims in cultural terms, and you rewrite certain cultural claims in economic terms, then one can't just simply dispense with this weak power of the false, but it may be more a matter of trying to overcode the weak power with the strong power, rather than vice versa, which was the operation so characteristic of the postmodern big theory years, where it was all lack all the time, literature hollowing out the positive claims of this or that totalizing discourse. So perhaps the postmodern call is not simply to abandon slowness, the work of the negative, or even nostalgia as a mode of literary engagement with the globalized world, but is maybe a call to reinvigorate some of those more positive powers of the false and modes of engagement with that world, and with literature's myriad positive critical connections to it, outside the negative suture of undecidability or interruption or something like that. So for example, maybe it's less a matter of abandoning literature's privileged relation to subjectivity, memory, and identity than it is a matter of re-emphasizing literature's roles in allowing us to become otherwise, right? The sort of positive powers of the false, how one becomes different, rather than negative powers of the false, how does one undermine what one thinks one is. Literature could again be a key component in the project that Foucault lays out for us in his late work, where he says, maybe the project nowadays is not to discover who we are, but to refuse who we are, right, to become something else. In the end, then, this is perhaps less a call to innovate new roles or jobs for literature, new modes of equipment, than to recall that literature was equipment for a whole lot of becomings before it became somewhat myopically equipment tailor-made to interrupt the totalizing claims of philosophy. So Homeric lyric, the speeches of the sophists or Socrates, the poets and rhetors of Rome, Beowulf, the jongleurs and roaming performers of the Middle Ages, the plays of Shakespeare, right up to the American context with the lectures of Emerson or Gertrude Stein's speaking tours. All these literary performances and practices harken back to a time, not that long ago, probably just before New Criticism, in fact, when something like meaning and the privilege of the written word and private reading were not the paramount questions or context for understanding what literature was. Anybody remember dial a poem in the 70s? That was where I first learned about poetry. You could call up and someone would read a poem to you. It was a tape. And literature can be a whole lot of things again in the future that seems to be festooned, which seems sure to be festooned with spam messages, pop-up ads, robocalls, ambient musics, talking vending machines, flash mobs, tweets and blog posts so enigmatic as to make the most difficult postmodern novels or avant-garde poetries seem recognizable and usable in different and new ways. Literature, of course, didn't choose the job of totalization interrupter par excellence. It was a job given to literature in the postmodern era of big theory. And hey, academic jobs have long been hard to come by. But for thousands of years beforehand, in fact for virtually all of its existence, literature was equipment for living in myriad ways, not just as a provider and or frustrator of meaning. Hopefully, a more robust sense of the literary can make it crucial, or at least useful, equipment again for postmodern living. Thank you.
So if there are questions?
Yes.
So, my question is more like, what is, the exact relation you just claim about the relation between ethics and aesthetics? Because I just that I read your book, Foucault Beyond the Foucault, and chapter 4 was about the globalization and ethics, and your position is more like the fluctuation between allegory and kind of body in some sense, because you are also the claiming about truth and subjective law, kind of that our that kind of practice and as a kind of intervention or interruptions, and also you are talking about some multitude things like that. So my question is more as I listen to your talk, your position is very the kind of in between of a lot of other thinkers, I guess, kind of, because you are also that I think that that you are talking about new way to truth and kind of that another way to resurrect the power of literature, kind of. So what is so that's the reason why I have a question about what is your opinion about that relation between ethics and aesthetics in postmodern world. What's the difference from the postmodern relation between ethics and aesthetics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think so. Alterity politics. The argument there, I think, is somewhat similar to the argument here, which is to say that it's often tempting to think that the ethical work of literature is its frustration of totalization, right? So ethics, because in the way that you can't totalize a reading of a poem, you can't totalize the socius or another person or a political situation, and that ethics is about keeping things open, right? Now that strikes me as being correct, but see, my argument in alterity politics and some of the argument here is that one of the things that it costs you to think about ethics as a lack is that there's this sort of normative horizon of wholeness which is preserved by that, right? So in other words, I'm to respect your difference because you're different from me, but there's a secret kind of resentment that we're not the same. There's this idea that we could be the same, but we fall short of sameness, so we all have to collectively mourn for the fact that we can't get along or we can't communicate or something like it. So there's sort of a negative version of ethics, which is, the consensus or communication is a horizon that's never reached, so we all have to sort of work together. But I think there's a more positive version of it, which is, what we have in common is our difference, and that one could affirm that difference to some degree, right? And I think that's, I think in terms of literature, much of the ethical work of literature over the years was completely beholden to that undecidability or interruption or lack thing, right? So in other words, a poem is like Associus because you can't ever exhaust it. But it still suggests that what you're supposed to be looking for in a poem is meaning, right? It preserves that sense that what you're looking for there is a horizon that you'll never reach. And it seems to me, again, there are costs to that, ethically speaking, that never really quite got talked about in the way they should. Again, which is to say that it protects this horizon of wholeness as you're always engaged in a project that you're never going to complete. So the whole thing is kind of ruled over by a certain kind of resentment. So I don't actually engage with the other, both producing a new world. I resent the fact that we have to share whatever's left for the fact that we can't communicate or we don't see eye to eye or something like it. So I think, again, there's ways of thinking about ethics and aesthetics. Aesthetics becomes a privileged realm for thinking about ethics in terms of, is aesthetics the sort of place where you can produce an entirely new world? Is that the sort of utopian quality of art? Is that what's interesting about it sociopolitically? Or is it this place of failure where we all have to learn to get along? And it seems to me I'm trying to push the sort of more, for lack of a better word, utopian version of it, right? Which is to say that what we learn from art is there are entirely new ways of organizing things. Right? When you look at a painting or you read a poem, it's an entirely different world. It's a world that's created ex nihilo, more or less. And I think that is, politically interesting, and that's where someone like Negri or other people would be interested in that productive thing rather than this kind of splintering or negative mode of interruption. Yeah.
I might ask you a contrasting question, rather than what's different about your work or what's new about it. What's really kind of a rehearsed argument from the politics of the power of the negative versus the power of the positive, and also the extent to which you borrow this term that you have, the hermeneutics of the situation, which really is pragmatism. And so how much of the work that you are proposing now comes from a really long history of negotiating and juggling the very terms, the very polemics that you've raised? So if you could talk a little bit about that historical trace in your own work.
Oh, almost all of it, I would think. In other words, I think that someone like Goldsmith is interesting to me. It's not so much inventing things as you are trying to highlight certain things. So on the weather, so this, and you can read it or not, but it's from 2003, and it's the moment where the invasion of Iraq begins. So the person who's giving the weather then sort of cuts between the weather in New York City and the weather in Iraq, right? And it causes these sort of interesting kind of juxtapositions. It's a good weekend, and in Iraq, battlefield conditions are swell. So it brings up all these kinds of questions about leisure time here and wartime there, and how wartime there, fight them there rather than fight them here. And it's not so much that you're making this up, that you're focusing people's attention on it in a certain way. And I think you're absolutely right. There's part of what I'm insisting on here is that literature had a myriad uses for a long, long time, and that in the last, from new criticism forward to, maybe to yesterday or something like it, a lot of those uses got territorialized on this question of meaning and its discontent. And I'm just trying to sort of point to the fact that that's not the only set of jobs that literature has had, and not the only set of jobs that it can have. And in fact, that kind of focus may blind us to all these other things that literature can do for us. And it was very good at doing that in the